Ahoy there, mates. Welcome aboard the VHS pirate ship and welcome to Reek of the Week, the little show here on the VHS pirate ship where I take a look at different aspects of 80s and 90s nostalgia. Yes, it's a show that has the sweet stench of childhood memories and reeks of nostalgia. It's the show you can smell. It's Reek of the Week. On this installment of Reek of the Week, I'm going to continue the Movie-Based Cartoon Saga, in which there are 2 previous episodes of, and I encourage you to check them out if you have not already. The links will be in the description. In the last episode, I discussed stuff like the Police Academy cartoon, Rambo: The Force of Freedom, Tales from the Crypt Keeper, and Robocop, the cartoon. And I had neglected to mention, and it should be mentioned, that there was a second Robocop cartoon with Robocop Alpha Commando, which first aired in September of 1998 and ran until February of 1999. This would have a more stylized design and animation than the original cartoon, but other than that, it's not really all that remarkable. And what made the original cartoon remarkable was that it was seemingly based on the R-rated movie. And as I explained in the previous Reek of the Week episode, the Robocop cartoon was more based on the Marvel Comics version. Robocop, as we knew him, would eventually become a family-friendly household name, and the franchise would stray far away from its original hard R-rated roots. With the PG-13 rated Robocop 3 and the live-action television shows, Robocop had long become a kid-friendly icon. So at that time, it really wasn't all that surprising or remarkable to have a kids cartoon based on Robocop with Robocop Alpha Commando. But it certainly was surprising and remarkable to have one in 1988. Because, well, in hindsight, it's just a little strange to have kids' products based on R-rated stuff. But, I mean, come on, let's not be too naive here. Kids do have a habit of eventually watching R-rated stuff with or without their parents' permission or supervision. And companies knew this full well, which is why we ended up with stuff like the talking Freddy Krueger doll. Interesting. But let's move along here and talk about some movie-based cartoons that are not based on R-rated franchises. And it would not be surprising at all that there was a Saturday morning cartoon show based on The Wizard of Oz with The Wizard of Oz, which first aired on ABC September of 1990. And this is, of course, based on the 1939 film and acts as a follow-up to it. And in true Saturday morning cartoon fashion, this takes an action-packed approach. Well, I'm not saying there's a bunch of guns and ninjas in it. That would be kind of strange. No, what I mean is Dorothy returns to Oz to save the wizard from a resurrected Wicked Witch of the West. So right away, the show stems from necromancy. Yeah, I sort of was not expecting that. Yeah, the flying monkeys apparently form some sort of cult and figure out a way to bring the Wicked Witch back from the dead. It's a rather interesting base. Okay, maybe it wasn't that extreme, but that's pretty much the gist. And as a Saturday morning cartoon show, it was alright, but it wasn't received very well and wasn't all that popular. It only had 1 season, which consisted of 13 episodes. But those 13 episodes would live on in syndication for years to come on a variety of premium cable channels. It has been said that this cartoon was supposed to coincide with the 50th anniversary of the film in 1989. Which in no doubt would have boosted the show's popularity just a little bit, but production was stalled and things got pushed back to 1990. Hey, that stuff happens. You can plan a pretty picnic, but you can't predict the weather. So that's that. And if you think this was not the only cartoon based on The Wizard of Oz, well, you're right. In 1986, there was a Japanese cartoon show called The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. And this was a pretty big show. It had 52 episodes and expanded upon the Oz universe, which would include adaptations of a variety of other Oz books. In 1992, there would be another Japanese cartoon show based on The Wizard of Oz called The Wonderful Galaxy of Oz, or Adventures of Space Oz. And this held an interesting take on The Wizard of Oz, as it was a sci-fi space opera adaptation. That's different. Back in the States, and way before the Saturday morning cartoon show, there was Tales of the Wizard of Oz from 1961, which was created by who would become known as Rankin and Bass. And in 1967, there was Off to See the Wizard, which did have animated segments featuring characters from The Wizard of Oz, but it was mainly a show that showcased old MGM movies. But the animated stuff was produced by Chuck Jones and featured the voice talents of Mel Blanc, so that's pretty cool. And it was narrated by Hal Holbrook, so that's pretty neat too. But that's enough of The Wizard of Oz. Let's talk about Swamp Thing. Pretty good segue, huh? Yes, Swamp Thing, the more unique amongst DC Comics' cadre of superheroes, got his own cartoon. Though being a rather short-lived one, this first aired in October of 1990, was shown sporadically, and then in May of 1991, it was all done. It had a grand total of a whopping 5 episodes? Jeez, that's not very many episodes, but it certainly was enough to get its own toy line from Kenner. This was a pretty neat toy line that sold very well, making Swamp Thing, for a brief time, a rather profitable DC Comics property, right up there with Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman stuff. So, that's pretty neat. This cartoon would have its own board game, many video games, and even one of those Tiger handheld electronics ones. You know the ones. Lucky us. There was Swamp Thing kids' bedroom slippers. I mean, look at that. That's just so beautifully absurd. There was Swamp Thing pencil sharpeners. There was Swamp Thing chalk. Look, I'm Chalk. Hey, that chalk can talk. Chalk does not actually talk. And there was a Swamp Thing bop bag. Remember bop bags? I should probably do a Reek of the Week episode about bop bags. They made them for everything back then. So the Swamp Thing cartoon is, of course, based on the comics, but it's also based on the 1982 live-action movie and its 1989 sequel, The Return of Swamp Thing, which are both based on the comics, of course. So it's a circle that feeds itself, and the cartoon show was not the only life that Swamp Thing had on television. There was a live-action Swamp Thing television show that premiered July of 1990 and ran all the way until May of 1993 with a grand total of 72 episodes. The show did very well and people were clearly all about Swamp Thing. There was even another live-action television show later on in 2019, so people love Swamp Thing. Which brings me to my next point, Jim Carrey. Man, I am on fire with these segues today. Yes, in the 90s, you could not look anywhere without seeing Jim Carrey in something, and the world of children's cartoons would see opportunity in the popularity of the actor, or rather the popularity of the films themselves, and there were a number of Jim Carrey films that were turned into kids' cartoons. And they would all be released within the same year. 1995 would give us cartoon versions of Ace Ventura, The Mask, and even Dumb and Dumber, with Dumb and Dumber being the least successful of the trio as it was canceled after only one season. But Ace Ventura and The Mask would last until 1997 and even had a crossover episode with each other, giving us a multiverse experience. Oh man, the last time I saw something like that was the Jeffersons Meet the Flintstones. Jetsons Meet the Flintstones. And it is important to note that these cartoons are based on Jim Carrey films, but Jim Carrey himself had nothing to do with them. And it also should be noted that the Ace Ventura cartoon enjoyed an extended life on television. After 97, it would be picked up by Nickelodeon and would run for another season until the year 2000. Moving right along, the 90s, much like the 80s, would give us its fair share of movie-based cartoons. Because we would also get Attack of the Killer Tomatoes, which is of course based on the 1978 film of the same name and its 1988 sequel, Return of the Killer Tomatoes. This cartoon first aired in September of 1990 and ran until November of 1991. It had 2 seasons comprised of 21 episodes, but those 2 seasons would live on in syndication all the way up until the year 2000. This was pretty popular, perhaps even surprisingly so. There were toys for this, Nintendo games, coloring books, lunch boxes, but as far as I know, there weren't any bedroom slippers or bop bags. And I don't believe there was any chalk for this either. So maybe it wasn't that popular after all, huh? Well, moving right along, the 90s would also give us Little Shop, which initially aired September of 1991 and ran until November of that same year. It had 1 season that was comprised of 13 episodes. And this rather forgotten about cartoon is based on the 1986 film Little Shop of Horrors, which in turn is based on the Broadway musical Little Shop of Horrors, which in turn is based on the 1960 Roger Corman film The Little Shop of Horrors. Phew! And it has been said that this cartoon is primarily based on the 1960 film and merely incorporates elements of the musicals. But that's really tit for tat and, whatever. And seriously, if you remember this cartoon, good for you. Because I certainly do not. Moving on, and I should say that movie-based cartoons aren't always all that cut and dry, and don't just represent merely one film, but instead are modified and adapted synopses of an entire film series. And really, only one comes to my mind, and that's James Bond Jr., which first aired September of 1991 and ran until December of that same year, had 1 season with a grand total of 65 episodes. The show followed the exploits of James Bond's nephew, James Bond Jr., and while it's not based on any particular James Bond film, it is a spin-off and an adaptation of the film series. And the characters featured in this series are either grandchildren or some other younger relation to James Bond characters. And before you think, much like I did, that this was just something that they made up for television, well, it's not. It's actually based on a 1967 novel, The Adventures of James Bond Jr. And James Bond Jr. has really been the only television series based on James Bond. However, it was not supposed to be the first cartoon based on James Bond. In 1988, there was talk of having a cartoon called James Bond vs. Spectre, but it never came to fruition. James Bond Jr. was pretty successful at the time and was a bit of a marketing powerhouse. Lots of merchandise for this. There was a toy line, a board game, video games, and yes, even one of those Tiger handheld electronic games. Yeesh. There was a James Bond Jr. wall clock, and in the UK, James Bond Jr. even had its own snacks with James Bond Jr. Mallows. Dare I say that James Bond Jr. might have been a bigger deal than what we thought at the time. Well, on that note, I'm going to wrap things up for today, and I had every intention of concluding the movie-based cartoon saga with this episode, but it seems there's still plenty more to cover, so stay tuned for the conclusion of the movie-based cartoon saga. I really appreciate you joining me here today for this installment of Reek of the Week. Be sure to hit subscribe, take care out there, and keep it locked right here, only on Captain Adam's VHS Pirate Ship. Goodbye, and God bless.